Welcome back to a study of General Biblical Introduction. And we come today to a completion of our thoughts about the Old Testament canon and its standardization. It's interesting that the Gospel Broadcasting Network has asked me to do this series. My name is Keith Mosher, Sr. I'm one of the instructors at the Memphis School of Preaching, and General Biblical Introduction is one of the courses at school that we take about 10 weeks, 6 hours a week spent on this subject. But I'll tell you that that's not enough time to study this subject. It's so vast and so wide. I wrote a book on the subject that I call the book God breathed, taking that statement from 2 Timothy 3:16. All Scripture is given by God's breath. And yet that book doesn't cover a fifth of what material could be printed. There are so many things now being discovered about the text. For instance, when I wrote my book, I made a statement in there about some canonical councils at Jamnia that the Jews held in AD 90. Well, it really wasn't, I know now, it really wasn't a canonical council. They just happened to get together. I do know now, historically speaking, and being a little more accurate than I knew at the time when I wrote the book, that there was a Rabbi Akiva who made great efforts to make sure that the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew language text, was standardized. And that text that he worked was the one that the Masoretic scribes used from AD 500 until the invention of the printing press to copy the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. And their work is so good that we can even argue about the credibility of the Old Testament canon from the fact that they were so meticulous in what they were doing. I even have statements now from modernistic collators and others who work on the text admitting that they've been trying to change the earlier text, undermine what it was that was actually passed down to us. And we have so many independent witnesses to the Old Testament canon that we are sure now that within the range of maybe 4 or 5 words, we're sure what the Old Testament text looked like. That's quite an accomplishment. And I'll say more about that when we get to the third section of General Biblical Introduction, which is textual criticism, which is the science of how the text is transmitted. But we're looking right now at which books belong in the Bible, and do we have all the books we're supposed to have. And I want to spend a few minutes today looking at some books that are called Apocrypha, capital A, P-O-C-H-Y-R-A, C-H-Y-P-H-A, excuse me, Apocrypha with a capital A. The reason I'm emphasizing the capital A is when you see that word spelled with a capital letter, the writer is referring to either 14 or 15 books that were written between the time Malachi wrote the last book of the Old Testament and Matthew's book starts in the New Testament. That's called the intertestament period of about 430 years. You have there in that period many books written that are not canonical. And I wanted to take a look at some of those today to help you. And as I go into that kind of a study, I also have to tell you, as honestly as I can, that there are some books in the Old Testament that have been questioned as to whether or not they actually belong. And I want to go over those with you also. Let me say that another way. 34 of the 39 books in the Old Testament have never been questioned as to their canonicity. Those 34 books are called homologumena. The other words, the one-word messages. Homo, one, legumena, one message. In other words, nobody has ever disagreed that those 34 books belong in the Bible. There have been some questions by men about the reception of 5 other books because there are 39 books in the Old Testament. The books that are questioned are called anti-legumena. they were originally accepted by the Jewish community that first received them, and it's the case that they were later disputed. But I think we can answer the disputes. So as we go into a study of books that don't belong, we're going to look first at 5 books in the Old Testament that have been disputed, and we'll tell you why as we go along. The first anti-legumena was the Song of Solomon. And some objected because of its sensuality. The rabbinical school of championed by a rabbi named Shammai, a very right-wing rabbi, questioned this text's place in the canon. The rabbi I just mentioned a moment ago, Akiba, defended it in Jamnia at that gathering. And he said something about this book that is still in my mind. Akiba called the Song of Solomon the Holy of Holies. He recognized that it's the greatest treatise on married love ever written anywhere, anytime. I'll say that again. This rabbi recognized that the Song of Solomon was the greatest treatise on married love that's ever been written. Selections from the book, in fact, from the scroll, were kept in the temple itself up until AD 70. And later, one half of the Jewish Talmud, called the Mishnah, contained a statement pronouncing a curse on anyone who thought the Song of Solomon was secular. Why, we wouldn't know what God thought about married love if it were not for the Song of Solomon. Sometimes the book is called Canonicity because it's lyric poetry, and parts of it especially are the songs of the two lovers. In fact, when I'm counseling folks in marriage, and I don't do much of that anymore at all, but when I did, I would give them a little homework, and I would tell them to read out loud to each other before they went to sleep the Song of Solomon, and feel the love between that husband and his wife and the love they're supposed to be sharing. The book is God's great treasure on married love. Well written, of course, inspired of God. And I think written by Solomon, who was inspired to write many Psalms, many Proverbs, and so on. But there have been folks who said the Song of Solomon doesn't really belong in the Old Testament. Oh, yes, it does. And I will stand right there with Rabbi Akiba and say, this is the Holy of Holies when it comes to married love. A second book that has been questioned is Ecclesiastes. Supposedly, some read it and think, well, the writer didn't know whether there was a God or not. Look how skeptical he is. Can't find anything good. Well, evidently those who critique the book that way have never read it, or if they read it, they missed it. Solomon wasn't saying there's nothing good. Solomon was saying that on earth, under the sun, that's the key to understanding Ecclesiastes, under the sun, it's all vanity. Unless, and as he got to the end of the book, Solomon didn't come away as an agnostic at all. He didn't come away as a skeptic at all. Listen to him as he gets to the end of his discovery about things on the earth that couldn't satisfy. He said, here's the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God. Does that sound like an agnostic or a skeptic? And keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man. And so how can it be that people would criticize him thinking, well, there's something agnostic about this writing? That's Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14. This writer, whom they claim didn't know God, said the only thing that keeps you going in this life, the only thing that makes you whole, is fearing God and keeping His commandments. It looks to me like Solomon just investigated everything, sort of experimented with anything he could under the sun, trying to find out what would satisfy him spiritually. Nothing did. Not his work, not his possessions, not his spouse, not that way. But the true spiritual satisfaction to Solomon was fearing God and keeping his commandments. I'm going to read you a statement from Beecher about this book called Ecclesiastes. And some of these critics who say it's written by a skeptic, therefore it shouldn't be in the canon, need to hear what Mr. Beecher said about this. In the early Christian centuries, as in all the centuries since, there have been disputes concerning the canonicity of Ecclesiastes. It was not questioned as to that Ecclesiastes belonged to the canon as traditionally handed down. No question of admitting it to the canon was raised, but it was challenged because of the agnostic quality. Does it sound to you like the writer was agnostic, that he didn't know whether there was a God, when he said the whole of man is fearing God and keeping his commandments? And so Ecclesiastes has been questioned, but I think it's questioned by those who don't get the point that Solomon was saying about things under the sun don't satisfy. There's a line in there in the 9th chapter that the dead know not anything. And so some have taken that verse to mean we're annihilated when we're dead. We're gone. We don't know anything. What they forget is what Solomon was doing. The dead know not anything under the sun. They don't know what's going on here, is the point. And he's just pointing out nothing here will satisfy you in heaven. Nothing under the sun is good enough to do that. Sometimes when I'm watching maybe a sports show like young boys playing football, and one will mention, well, my mother passed away, but I know she's watching me now. No, she can't. She can't look back here. That's what Solomon meant. The dead know not anything under the sun. Well, that's not written by somebody who thinks there's no afterlife, who's some kind of agnostical skeptic. And so, does Ecclesiastes belong? Absolutely. And it's an experiment by a man who was seeking spiritual relief all over the place and couldn't find it except in fearing God. A third book that has been spoken against by some, another anti-legumena, is the book of Esther. Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Esther. Why? No word God in it. It's supposed to be in the Bible and having God's description in it. No word God. It's not mentioned. Some commentators miss that point. They'll say, well, Esther didn't use Yahweh, the covenant name for God, because they were in Persian captivity. Well, just because they were in captivity didn't mean the Jews weren't under covenant. They still were. They were still God's children. However, God's name is mentioned in other books of the same period, they say, yes. But the book of Esther has a word in it, first word, and the first letter of that word is and. It just takes one letter in the Hebrew to indicate and. That letter is affixed to the first word in the book of Esther. This one who wrote it, Esther, knew to join her book to another in a series. She was connecting her book to 1 Chronicles. And so, connecting her book to 1 Chronicles, there was no need to mention God. He's already mentioned in that series. She connected it to 1 Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah, really. And extra canonical writings, in fact, suggest that the book of Esther would be the only one that would survive during the days of Messiah. Well, they had such great respect for it. In fact, they have a great feast today, celebrating what she did for them. Had Esther not been able to stop the slaughter of the Jews in Persia, it would have been the case that the seed line of Messiah would have ended in Persia rather than with Christ in Palestine many years later. The leading attacker on Esther was Martin Luther. Why? Too much work. Esther, you go to work. You call to the kingdom for such a time as this. Esther 4:14. Luther attacked anything that indicated any kind of work at all in order to be God's child. Well, that's sad. But Luther was not afraid to add a word to God's word. And at Romans 3:28, he put the word only right after the word faith in his German translation, so that he could indicate men are saved by faith only. Allein. Well, it's very dangerous to add to God's word because you bring a curse on yourself when you do that. But again, the leading attacker, well, there's no word God in it. One of my students did a paper on Esther and was interested to find that some Jewish scholars think that there's an acrostic YHWH in the book because of the first letters of certain paragraphs. I would not know how far to push that thought. But look what you have there. The great providence of God is working throughout Esther. The book, at the time that Esther wrote the book, God's working to save his people from extinction. And they still celebrate her victory in saving the Jews. So we have the book of Esther. The only critic really is Luther, and he's criticizing it because he got his doctrine wrong. Then you have the book of Ezekiel. I mentioned earlier a rabbi named Shammai. Well, he represents a school of rabbinical thought that was very conservative, but sometimes to the extreme. And Shammai actually said that Ezekiel's teachings were anti-Moses. And what Ezekiel did was introduce a difference between the Levitical priesthood and the one he was suggesting. So he's trying to change the priesthood. Well, that school of rabbinical thought missed it. And if they had understood it, they may have denied it, because Ezekiel was telling us when the church of Christ comes, the priesthood changes. Ezekiel's prophecy was about the coming church. And he wrote during a time when he was in captivity. And when he was in captivity, he still was rebuking the Jews for their rebellion against God. But his book is a great prophecy of the coming priesthood of believers, 1 Peter 2, 5 through 9, and so on. The priesthood of Christian believers. Of course, the priesthood changed. Christians are the priests today. We're a building block in the Church of Christ. We are a royal priesthood, 1 Peter 2, 9. And so the critics by the Jews of Ezekiel didn't understand what he was saying. And finally, the other book that has been criticized for a kind of a silly reason, really, is Proverbs. If you'll open your Old Testament to the book of Proverbs and go to chapter 26, you can read verses 4 and 5 there. Verse 4 says, "Answer not a fool according to his folly." Verse 5 says, "Answer a fool according to his folly." And the critic goes, "Aha! There is your contradiction right there in the Bible. That book doesn't belong, and it probably just denigrates the entire text itself. The whole Bible should be thrown out because there's a contradiction in those two verses. So God couldn't have written it because there should be no contradictions if God had it written. Well, let's look at that a moment. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou also be like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. Well, to argue there's a discrepancy there or a contradiction makes me realize that this person who said this does not know how to translate or interpret a proverb. If I said to you, for instance, look before you leap, there's a proverb. Look before you leap. Be cautious, right? But at the same time, I might say, he who hesitates is lost. Did I contradict my first statement? Well, if you don't understand Proverbs, you'd think I did, because he who hesitates is lost. I mean, jump to it. Jump to it. Well, look before you leap. No contradiction, because a proverb is covering a certain situation specifically and nothing else. And so the understanding of those two statements is very easily seen when you think some fools should be answered and some shouldn't. And you'll have to make a decision which it is. There are some fools that you just should ignore. There are some that you're going to have to answer. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. That's Psalm 19:1. Well, listen. Psalm 14:1, excuse me. Listen, that fool should be answered because he's denying the existence of God. We need to answer him, or he'll be wise in his own conceit. We need to answer the evolutionist who says there's no God. He's wrong. He believes in eternal dirt. He's wrong. And so there are some fools we should answer. Others who make foolish statements shouldn't be answered. Jesus told his disciples one time after they had come to him and said, you just offended those folks. He said, leave them alone. They be blind leaders of the blind. If the blind lead the blind, they'll fall in the same ditch. We don't need to answer that. So sometimes you need to answer, sometimes you don't. There's no contradiction. But if you think there's one, that's because you misunderstand how Proverbs are used and what they mean. So many mistakes have been made, even by some who are supposed to be gospel preachers, in the Proverbs and the use of them, because they think that somehow there's a universal statement here covering all situations. No. A proverb covers a certain situation, and that's it. So it's possible to answer a fool in his folly. It's possible not to give him an answer. Depends on how foolish or how against God the statement is. And so we don't have a contradiction. Now those 5 books that are spoken against, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Ezekiel, Proverbs, all belong in God's holy word along with Esther. And so they're spoken against, but usually by folks who really don't understand what's being said in the text. I suppose if you don't want to believe that the Bible is God's word, you can come up with all kinds of objections. Well, it's just written by man, or the community produced it, or it just evolved over the years and somebody edited it. You get all kinds of criticisms of God's holy word. But when you can give a plausible answer to an objection, you've killed the objection. And for these folks to speak against those 5 books just shows to me that they're ignorant of what the book actually says. They have not really come to the proper conclusion of the text. Well, those are the anti-legumena, and since they belong, we have 39 books in the Old Testament. But I want to talk now about some books that don't belong. And I think as we go along reviewing them, you'll figure out quite quickly why they don't belong. These are those capital A Apocrypha. Let me say again, capital A Apocrypha. When it's a capital letter A, that's a reference to the 14 or 15 books in the intertestament period. Never were inspired, and no claim can be made for their inspiration. If you see the little letter A on the word Apocrypha, the writer is talking about the New Testament apocryphal books, and there are a multitude of them. Most of them were written by a group of people called Gnostics, and I'll have something more to say about that a little in another session. But the Apocrypha, 14 or 15 books, depending on whom you are reading. There are some books, not one book is left out. Today, you mostly find these books in Catholic Bibles between the Testaments to indicate the time that they were written in the intertestament period, between the Old and the New Covenants. The word Apocrypha is an interesting term. It means dark or hidden. And the discerning reader will keep in mind when they were written. They were produced before Christ came, but they are used by Roman Catholics especially for their own doctrinal biases. They borrow some things from these non-inspired books and practice them. The world that produced these apocryphal books was a Greek world, speaking in Greek world. But it was a Roman world. That was the empire. And it was a Jewish culture. So sometimes you had Jewish writers who could write in Greek, but they were living in the Roman Empire. Or maybe they wrote it in Hebrew. And we'll talk about that as we go along. But notice the culture. Roman Empire, Greek-speaking, Jewish culture. All three of those are in this person's makeup when he writes these kinds of books. The Greek literature of that period was changing the way it wrote. You didn't get heroic tales anymore in the intertestament period from the Greeks. You didn't have an Odyssey or some hero like that. And they were starting to write about everyday, real-world problems. The Greeks were. Well, the anti-Greek Jews, especially the Maccabees, had another problem. They were trying to find national independence from the Seleucid Empire, the Grecian Seleucids. So you've got Jews here who are anti-Greek culture. They're some of the writers. Roman dominance was in place, but Greek philosophy affected the multitudes. In fact, it infected many New Testament Christians. Greek philosophy did. To the Greeks, for a God to die was foolish. So they didn't believe in the cross or the death of Christ. To them it was foolishness. And so their philosophy led them away. There is a sect of Jews not mentioned in Scripture unless there's a veiled reference to them, but they were called Essenes. We know about this sect from the Dead Sea Scrolls. But that sect was enamored of Greek philosophy, especially Pythagoras. Well, think about the culture now. Roman, Greek, Jewish. And out of that culture comes the books. The books come that are apocrypha. And we're going to look at some of them here just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. And you'll better understand when we look at what they're teaching and some of their statements, why they're not in the Bible. I mean, just by reading this kind of material, you can tell the difference between it and a true text from God. These books we're about to discuss were written by men, period, who had a Greek, Roman, Jewish background and a kind of mixed up background, an eclectic culture. And the first book I want to mention is First ESDRAS. It's a history, claims to be a history, but it's not authentic. And the writer claimed to be writing about how the Jews were restored from Babylonian captivity. The writer drew his ideas and actual statements from the book of First Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah. But he put in the middle of all the truth there some fantastic stories, legends, and there are certainly a lot of discrepancies in First Ezra. This book, incidentally, in the Greek Old Testament, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, the LXX, the Septuagint, this book is called Third Esdras. And so is it called that in the Latin Vulgate. From about 150 BC is the authorship time of this book, 150 BC. And the historical accounts, especially the legend of the three young Jews in the court of Darius, has no parallel in the Bible. The purpose of the uninspired writer was to emphasize the contribution of Josiah, Zerubbabel, and Ezra to the reform of post-exilic Jewish worship. They had nothing to do with it, post-exilic. No, the man who reformed the way they worship was Ezekiel. And so the writer of First Ezra even mistakenly gave credit to three who had nothing to do with reestablishing worship for the Jews or changing it in any way. First Ezra. There's another book called Second Esdras. It's Jewish, but it's an apocalyptic style. It's Hebrew, but it's apocalyptic style. It reads a little bit like the book of Revelation does. The seer of the book, supposedly instructed by the angel Uriel, sound familiar? You know of a book in our time that supposedly was given to a man by an angel named Moroni. This book supposedly was given by the angel Uriel. And the writer claims he knows all the answers to the problems in this world. The writer talks about the problems in Jerusalem because of Roman persecution. Well, the pathetic attempts of this writer to solve all the world's problems comes through quite clearly to the reader. And so, for that matter, do his discrepancies in terms of his historical references. And so you have a book here claiming to be writing about the Jewish problems and claiming to be a product from God when it clearly is filled with errors. Second Esdras. The third apocryphal book I want to mention is Tobit. It was written somewhere around 190 BC. It's a novel. I suppose we ought to have some soap opera music as we read this one. Whoever wrote this was a Pharisee. The book is legalistic to the extreme. It would be very highly criticized by the Lord as being written by a hypocrite. The book emphasizes the law of Moses, clean foods, ceremonial washings condemned by the Christ, Mark 7, fasting and prayer. Well, the text is totally unscriptural in insisting that giving to the poor all by itself absolves one of sin. Tobit chapter 3. If you've ever read any of the novels called Arabian Nights, you probably would recognize the style of writing in Tobit. The story goes there was a pious Jew named Tobit who lived in Nineveh. That's in Assyria. He was captured by Assyria in the 8th century BC, according to this book. He's a very pious Jew, but he's poor and blind. That's not an uncommon theme in apocryphal writing. Poor and blind. See, the Jews are always feeling sorry for themselves. In fact, on one occasion, the Lord actually met a blind man, and his disciples said, "Who did sin? This man or his parents that he was born blind?" John 9:1. Well, how would you sin before you're born? So you'd be born blind. So this idea of poor and blind was a pitiable state according to Jewish thought. So here's Tobit, praying now, no money, he's blind. Well, God hears Tobit's prayer. At the same time in the story, we're told that there was a demon-possessed girl named Sarah who lives very far north in Media, the Medo-Persian Empire, Media. And she is demon-possessed. Well, God sends an angel. Here we go again with these angels, named Raphael, whoever that is, to save Tobit and Sarah. Then the plot thickens. And we really need some music here, because the novel now tells us that Tobit called his son, Tobias, to go to the town of Media to collect some money owed him. Well, Tobias is going to go there. Would you guess whom he met? And while he's there in Media, meeting Sarah, the blind girl, Raphael tells Tobias how to cure his daddy's blindness with some magical formulas. You want to put that in the Bible? And he releases Sarah from her demon lover, Asmodeus. I wonder where the movie's got that name. Tobias does what Raphael tells him, cures his dad's blindness, and marries Sarah. And they rode off into the sunset, happily ever after. There's a book claiming to be spiritual. Well, it's a lot of fun to read, but it's a novel. It's not inspired. We come next to the book called Judith. Soap opera. This is a romance novel. The writer claimed to be living in the 6th century during Nebuchadnezzar's reign in Babylon. We know better. It was written about 190 BC. It has no historical value whatsoever. In fact, it's filled with situation ethics. The morality of the book of Judith is not from God. There is too much sensuality, fornication, and so on in the book. But there's no value here. Judith is the heroine, of course, of the book. And she uses her beauty to gain a place in the tent of a Babylonian general. She fills him full of liquor. He falls into a drunken stupor, and she cuts off his head. And by so doing, stops the army from invading her people. This book is a good example of ancient Jewish storytelling. And it has inspired numerous plays and plots in movies and books, many paintings and sculptures. And they all teach the same idea that Judith taught. The end justifies the means. It's all right to be a harlot as long as you kill the general. Christianity is not an end justifies the means religion. We have to figure out how we got there too. Or what we're doing has no benefit to us at all spiritually. So here you have a book now teaching the end justifies the means. Then there's a book, and here's one written by a fellow who thought he'd just help us out with Esther. This book's called The Rest of Esther. It's written in Greek, incidentally, automatically denying its connection to Esther. There are any number of visions and letters and prayers in it. It was composed about 100 BC. The writer was trying to compensate for the lack of the mention of the name of God in the book of Esther. Originally, when it first came out, the Bible makers would put this right there connected to Esther. It has 107 verses in it. And Jerome removed those additions from Esther when he was doing his Latin translation of the Bible. But he removed them and then put them at the end all by themselves of the book of Esther in his translation. You know what the problem is here? Any number of those verses contradict what's said in Esther. The rest of Esther is a mess of contradictions of the biblical text. We come next to what to me is the best of the apocryphal books in terms of how it was written and its ethicalness and so on. This is called the Book of Wisdom, or the Wisdom of Solomon. This book condemns sin and extols righteousness. It was written about 30 BC. It was intended by the writer, I think, to keep the Greek-speaking Jews from losing their faith. So many were holding this Greek philosophical view that the flesh is evil, that this book was written trying to help them not lose their faith. The lateness of the production, 30 BC, and the attempt by the author to impersonate Solomon speak loudly against its inspiration. There are some noble sentiments in the book. It's useful in terms of understanding what was moral among the Jews at that time, but certainly trying to fake Solomon as the writer already tells me it's not canonical, and it isn't. The next book I want to mention is Ecclesiasticus. I mentioned this book in another session. We know who wrote it. Jesus, Jesus, Ben, son of Sirach, S-I-R-A-C-H. It's a long book. It's a long treatise on morality and practical goodness. It's in the Hebrew language. It was written about 180 BC. It's patterned after the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. And it's the only book in the Apocrypha in which the writer is named. That's in chapter 50, verse 27 of Ecclesiasticus. We know the author was a Jewish scribe who conducted an academy for young Jewish men. That's in 51:23 of the book. And it's simply a compilation of Sirach's years of lecturing on ethics and religion. Ecclesiasticus means the church book. And in the title given by Catholicism, and it is insisted by Catholicism that this book is inspired. Well, we know it isn't. We know who wrote it. It was a scribe, not an inspired writer, not a prophet. The next book I want to mention is Baruch. It's the weakest imitation of Jeremiah's written style ever produced. Written about AD 70. Maybe the fellow was running from the Roman army at that time, I don't know. But it's not a very well written book. The author describes himself as witnessing the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BC. That's interesting, because the book was produced in AD 70. The Jews revolted against Rome, not Babylon. The real Baruch was Jeremiah's secretary, Jeremiah 32:12. But this Baruch is a fake, and the book is unquestionably non-canonical. In fact, there's a forgery in it. And that forgery, under Jeremiah's name, became a book in itself, separate and apart from Baruch. But what the book I'm about to mention to you right now is the 7th chapter, was originally the 6th chapter, of the uninspired book called Baruch. That's the letter of Jeremiah. That letter is a warning to the Babylonian captors about idolatry. But it was addressed to Greek-speaking Jews in Alexandria, Egypt. And this book is filled, the letter of Jeremiah is, with illogical connections between the statements made against idolatry. It's strangely written, full of contradictions, does not belong in the canon. The letter of Jeremiah. Incidentally, many people who wrote apocryphal books tried to put a name on it that everybody would recognize, I suppose trying to sell the book. I come now to the sons of the three holy children, the song of the three holy children. This is supposed to be what Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah sang as they were thrown into the fiery furnace. I don't remember reading in Daniel that they sang anything. This is Psalm 148 rewritten. The fellow just stole the statements from Psalm 148 and sort of put them in his own words. And so we have a fake book about a fake song, supposedly sung by three thrown into the furnace. The next book I want to mention is also a romance novel. It's called The History of Susanna. It's supposed to show how wise Daniel was, who delivered Susanna from two men who tried to seduce her, and when she yelled for help and they ran out, the two, went to the authorities and said, well, she's married, and we found her in the arms of a young man, that's why she screamed. Well, in the book, Daniel interrupts the court proceedings, and he begins to cross-examine the two witnesses separately. And he asks each one, under which tree did you find Susanna in the arms of that man? Of course, they disagreed, and their conflicting answers had them put to death, and Susanna is saved. And so we have some music here at the end, I suppose, to celebrate the triumph of Daniel over those two. There's no spiritual value to the story whatsoever. Certainly does not belong in the Bible. But it too has inspired plays and books and things over the years. The next book I want to mention is Bel, B-E-L, and the Dragon. This is also supposed to be about Daniel. Bel was the god of the Babylonians, sometimes called Marduk. And Daniel slays the dragon and Bel an idol. Well, the dragon and the idol were two objects of Babylonian worship. There's also contained a fictional account of Daniel's deliverance from the lion's den. This text was added to the book of Daniel in the same year, about 30 BC, that the history of Susanna was. Daniel 14, it's called. Bel and the Dragon, Daniel chapter 14. History of Susanna, Daniel chapter 13. Well, in the book, Bel and the Dragon, Daniel's a very clever detective. Detective? I thought he was a prophet in Babylon. Anyways, he finds out that the priests of Bel would put out plates of food for the statue, and it would disappear, and they claimed the living God Bel ate it. Well, of course, Daniel uncovered the fact that they had sneaked in there and ate it themselves. But it's interesting how Daniel slays this dragon. He puts together some fat, some tar, and some hair, and that concoction kills the dragon. Well, the Babylonians, irate after Daniel killed their god, threw him into the lion's den. And the prophet Habakkuk feeds him. Well, they didn't live at the same time. And Habakkuk had that, bringing that food all the way from Jerusalem every day to feed Daniel in the lion's den. Bel and the Dragon. It's a comic book, but it doesn't belong in the Bible. I hope you're getting the idea from listening to this, how easy it is to tell, how easily it can be told, the difference between these kinds of writings and the inspired books themselves. I come next to the prayer of Manasseh. Well, there's a prayer mentioned, 2 Chronicles 33, 18 and 19. But this was composed in 150 BC. And it's not in the Bible, of course. It's Jewish poetry. It's good Jewish poetry. But we don't have a record of Manasseh's prayer. And we know when this book was composed, it's not inspired. The next book is used because it has some good history in it. This is 1 Maccabees. It's usually reliable in its history, and it helps us with understanding the Intertestament period and the struggles for independence by the Maccabean families, led by Judas, Jonathan, and Simon. These people were important to Judaism and their efforts against Roman imperialism. The author was a Palestinian Jew. He lived in Jerusalem. His history is written after the style of 1 and 2 Kings. He covered the conquest of Alexander, the division of Alexander's empire, the origin of the Ptolemaic and Seleucid empires, and he recounts the principal events of Judah's history. But it's obviously a history book, not an inspired book of the Bible. The next and last of these books is 2 Maccabees. It covers the history of Judaism from 175 BC to 160 BC. It's not as well written as 1 Maccabees. In fact, there are some contradictions with 1 Maccabees in 2 Maccabees. It's not a sequel to 1 Maccabees. And certainly, we know that the tales told are not historically accurate. The Protestant world has never accepted the Apocrypha as canonical. Roman Catholicism only rejects 1st and 2nd Esdras and the Prayer of Manasseh. The rest, even the fictional romance novels, are thought to be inspired by that group. The apocryphal books teach that suicide is honorable. If you put incense and fish hearts on hot coals, that will drive away the devil. You can be saved from sin by giving to the poor, as I've already noted earlier. That's works doctrine. That's the doctrine of the Catholic Church. Judith's book teaches it's more honorable to be single, even if you fornicate. Well, Roman Catholicism forbids its priests to be married. In the book of Judith, it is also said that murder is honorable if it advances the cause of the righteous. According to the wisdom of Solomon, that book says the souls in hell can get out. The Bible teaches differently. The Second Maccabees argues that one can pray for the dead and to the dead. Tobit argues for social drinking. And in Second Maccabees, as I've already noted, you can pray to dead saints. And then immoral behavior, according to Judith, is condoned by God. It's interesting that 1 Maccabees chapter 4 through chapter 9 denies that the Apocrypha are God-inspired. The book itself says we're not inspired. Well, doesn't it reflect the thought of the Old Testament? It does, but so do some of my sermons, and they're not inspired. All of these things mentioned need to be understood about the fact that they are not inspired and do not belong in the Bible. Jesus knew the Greek Septuagint. He never mentions the Apocrypha because they weren't in it until much later in the history of that book. We have looked at Old Testament canon, the false books, and we have come to the conclusion that the 39 books from Genesis to Malachi are all that God wants us to have, and they are exactly what God wants us to have. Thank you for watching this session of General Biblical Introduction.